It is The Burning Platform, which is brought to you every Thursday by Nando's. And we're joined, as usual, by our two interlocutors. They are Kanthan Pillay and Phumi Mashego. And this morning, also our special guest, Helen Zille. And we're going to talk about lots of things today. So we've got quite an agenda for you. If you have questions or if you have comments or if you have something you'd like to throw into the discussion, you are welcome to do so. All you need to do is send us a message on either 0797482090, or you can actually comment while you're watching the show live, which is possible by going to cliffcentral.com and just clicking on the link. So Helen Zille is here, and Phumi Mashego and Kanthan Pillay and you and I, and we are going to launch straight into a conversation about what the president said last night. Now, Phumi and I, just so you know, had some discussion about this already, but I'd like to know what everybody else thinks. Was it necessary for him to interrupt the broadcast of my show, for heaven's sake, to announce pretty much nothing?
Well, he announced that alcohol was now going to be sold 24/7. I know Helen's probably going to frown upon that with a slight hint of disapproval. But yeah, well, I suspect that that's going to earn him some brownie points. But I think, more significantly, we should look at the fact that he's probably trying to recover some ground after the by-elections that took place. And, no doubt many people are trying to do the same.
I want to get into the by-elections just now. I know Phumi was also paying attention to those. But any comment from you, Phumi and Helen, about the president's address to the nation last night? Do you think he just did it because he was feeling left out?
You always give the elders the space to go first. So, Helen, I'll go after you.
Okay, age before beauty, I don't mind. Listen, the way I understand it is this. The president came on at 8 o'clock. I couldn't understand why he came on at 8 p.m. during the last hour of major by-elections. We had many, many by-elections across South Africa, the most ever in one day. And he came on in the final hour, and what he basically said was he's throwing South Africa open for the tourist season. That is the main notion that I got from it. He's saying we're extending the state of emergency till the 15th of December, which is the last bloody thing we want, the state of disaster, till the 15th of December, but he is opening South Africa up, which is really good. And I think it's very important, otherwise the tourism industry won't survive this next tourist season. He also announced a period of mourning from the 25th to the 29th of November. And he did a few other things, but the thing that worried me and the very bad part about it is he's extending the state of disaster, which gives the ANC absolute power through the Minister of Kokta, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. At the same time, he did open up, so that wasn't a bad thing.
Explain to me, because most of us are not entirely sure of how these things work. The state of disaster specifically empowers Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma to make decisions without having to have Parliament say so. Is that more or less what it is?
That's more or less what it is.
What do they need this for at this stage? Or is it more a question of wanting it than needing it?
I think it's more a question of wanting it than needing it. When you give a government an enormous amount of power and the absolute free rein not to be accountable to anybody and to make decrees around a whole range of issues and not have to go through legitimate constitutional structures, but to be able to speak from the National Corona Command Council through to the district command councils, through to the ward-based war rooms, as they're called, then you're basically bypassing the constitutional system of government and ruling by decree. And that is what the National State of Disaster allows under the Disaster Management Act. And that's
effectively, all of those things you described, Helen, are in fact just simply collections of cadres that make decisions down to the lowest possible level.
That's exactly what it is. It's a command structure. It's a command structure that bypasses the constitutional mechanisms of accountability.
Well, no wonder they don't want to stop with it. I mean, that makes perfect sense then. Now, now that you've explained exactly how it flows down. So, Phums, your thoughts on the president's address? Because I know you didn't watch it. Phum's smarter than us. She actually didn't. She didn't bore herself to death by having to sit through the whole address. Instead,
I didn't watch it either. I just waited for the transcript to be forwarded on WhatsApp.
Yeah, well, you at least did that. Phumi just checked it out on Twitter. Yeah. But you got the salient points. So, Phums, any ideas on the president? And we can move on to other stuff. Pumi? I think we've lost her. All right.
I somehow think that Pumi doesn't want to be commenting on this particular thing this morning because she first passed the buck across to Helen. But one of the things that I must point out is that he also said that he's extending payments through until the
Esther's payment.
Yeah, that's correct. Yes, and I think Pumi is trying to speak, but we can't hear her at this point.
Pums, are you on mute by any chance? This is like that ANC MP.
She's pointing at her ears, and she's now doing a sign language interpretation that's reminiscent of what was that guy's name at Janchi, yes, the sign language interpreter, yes. Okay. All right, Pumi, well, I don't speak sign language at the moment, so let's go back to the president's speech. So I think really it was just a question of him being able to make the declaration around the fact that these various restrictions were being lifted. Mm-hmm. I think certainly the opening up of international flights is going to be absolutely essential, particularly if we want tourists coming into the Western Cape. Not that we have a vested interest right now in the Western Cape, given that they want to secede from the rest of the country. But
well, can we talk about that quickly, Helen? Because there are two things that I'd like to discuss. I know you can't speak on behalf of the DA. You're the federal chairperson, which is very different to being the leader. I'm not going to put you in a position where you have to answer things that are actually John Steenhuisen's preserve. But there are things that I need to ask you about, because the DA hasn't really got any position on something like Cape independence. And it keeps coming up. In fact, there was a news article just yesterday about Cape independence. Can you speak, just first of all, as Helen Zille, a resident of the Western Cape, and tell us what you would think of that as a private citizen? And then perhaps also give us some indication of what the politicians are thinking, not just in the DA, but what you know from the people you speak to. And you've been in politics for a while, so you know more people than we do about things like Western Cape independence. Is there any possibility in the faintest of ways or places or imaginations that this could happen?
Well, it's not practically possible. That's the thing. Forget about whether it's desirable or not, or in principle should be pursued or not. The big question is, how would it be possible? Now, Section 235 of the Constitution makes it possible to have a specific geographical territory for a specific group, but it requires a long process through Parliament. It requires to be passed through Parliament. It requires
I think Helen's frozen now too.
It does look like the fates are conspiring against us this morning. Helen seems to be back. Right. We lost you for a minute there, Helen.
Where did you lose me?
Somewhere after you'd said that the Constitution does make provision for certain people to occupy a certain space, but then we lost you. You froze up. Okay. Now, there's no way that is going to get through Parliament, as it is required to do under Section 235 of the Constitution. So if there is going to be a secession of the Western Cape, even if we could have a referendum on it, which we can't because there's no national legislation enabling a referendum, it would almost have to happen through a civil war, through a kind of UDI. Sure.
Even if it were possible, and let's look at theoretically if it were possible. Let's presume that under the DA's policies, the economy would thrive and blossom and create lots of jobs. Inevitably, it would attract desperately poor job seekers from across the subcontinent.
Right.
And the Western Cape has a very, very long border. It borders the east, from the Eastern Cape in the east to the Northern Cape in the west and the north, and everything in between. So we've got an incredibly long border. Now, if you're an independent country, how do you protect your borders? I just want to ask that question.
Well, you build a wall, surely.
We can't get we can't get to that point without a civil war. We can't maintain that position. And do you think for 1 second we'd be allowed to run a free economy in the rest of Southern Africa? There'd be all kinds of tariffs and all kinds of excise duties and various other things would make it incredibly difficult to run an economy.
So you're basically saying it's a moot point, and there's no real reason to carry on discussing this because the facts that would bring it about would be the same facts that would make it impossible for it to stay in existence.
Yes, I mean, I really cannot understand at all how it could happen without a civil war. And B, I cannot understand how it could be maintained and sustained.
Mm.
Listen to practicalities here. Whether people would love it to happen, whether people believe that where the DA governs, we govern better, and we definitely do that. And if therefore people say, well, if the majority in the rest of the country doesn't want to change their vote and doom South Africa to government by a criminal syndicate, then the rest of us have an opportunity to just opt out of that. Yes, it sounds really good in theory, but in practice, no one has yet told me how it is possible. We can't even get to hold a referendum on it in the Western Cape because the law specifically does not exist to allow us. The Constitution says you cannot hold a referendum unless there is that national legislation. So there are major campaigns that have to be done before you can asking the question abide by the Constitution and the rule of law. And the alternative to that is a civil uprising.
So, Helen, let's talk about yesterday in these by-elections, because it really did go by without terribly much attention. And obviously, if you lived in these wards, you might have seen a little bit more of the noise and the activity. But many of us didn't even know about this until you brought it up this morning. So tell us what these by-elections were all about and how everybody fared, because obviously you will have been paying much closer attention than we were.
Well, before Helen gets through the starting post there, Gareth, I just want to point out that the DA contested 24 wards as the incumbent, and they lost 9 of these. And they took 1 from the ANC, and they lost some to the ANC, but they lost most of them to smaller parties like Good and Al Jamaa and Freedom Front Plus and so forth. And this is an interesting turn of events for me because effectively, the wards being contested. The incumbents, happen to be DA people who I assume have governed well over the past period, but still, that's a bit of a trouncing, 9 out of 24 wards being taken. And I think this is signs to a larger realignment that's happening right now in South Africa's politics, where there's an inherent distrust of the bigger parties and a push towards smaller parties that are, really driven by personality rather than any sort of principle. So that's kind of my starting point in terms of this. But so let's take it from there.
Well, I think to say that we lost 9 is a bit rough, Kanthan, because we gained 2. So there's a net loss of 7. And people have lost more wards, basically. But I think if you have to look at it in the bigger picture. 2016 was an extraordinarily good election for us. The last local government election was 2016.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the course of events, and we've had some really rough events subsequent to 2016, in the course of events, councillors die, they resign, etc., etc.
Sure.
And for the entire period of the lockdown, we have not been able to have by-elections, obviously. So whereas you would have 1 or 2 by-elections every month, maybe 3 or 4, they've all piled up, and suddenly then in one day, you have scores and scores of by-elections because they've been piling up over 9 months. And that was what we had yesterday. Now, it's very hard to generalize across the whole spectrum, but what is clear is this. In this tidal wave of identity politics that has really swept the world, parties that occupy the moderate, non-racial, rational center are under huge pressure by this incredible sweep of identity politics. And that means that, take a ward in Johannesburg, you had Ward 68, you had Ward 120, you had Ward 9. All of them representing broadly what one would term ethnic minorities. 2 in the greater area of Lenasia, 1 in the greater area of Riverlea.
Mm-hmm.
Is a party like the Patriotic Alliance
Right.
led by Vic, who's very open about the way he understands politics, basically a means to enrich yourself and manipulate the outcome of processes. Now, here's a guy appealing directly to an ethnic base, dishing out food parcels, of course, which has become a norm, certainly not for us, but a kind of buy your vote scheme the night before the election. And they win a ward. Now, that is a straight ethnic vote in a context where there has been a very profound alienation in Johannesburg with the way that Herman Mashaba governed and then left, and in the way that he did. If you look at Lenasia, it's even worse. I was in Lenasia not too long ago. Lenasia is, in many places, a beautiful suburb. It used to be a real township, and it's become the most beautiful suburb. And all around now, there have been massive land invasions, which have changed the demographics completely. And the people of Lenasia, who've built that suburb up from really a township, a suburb, are furious and were really cross with Herman Mashaba's government that he wasn't stopping these land invasions. And so they have split off into the smaller ethnic parties like for example, and are voting for Al-Jamaa. And the new residents there who are in the shack settlements around Lenasia vote for the ANC. So what you get is those tiny little parties splintering the rational moderate center. And the result is that either the ANC wins or one of the tiny parties wins. And that is what you're seeing as a phenomenon around South Africa. So it's not great news in the context of trying to build a party that is non-racial, that believes in the rule of law, that believes to succeed in South Africa if those of us come together in the center to protect each other's rights. These little ethnic nationalist parties are very dangerous to their enterprise. They win wards. They can't make any difference usually in councils, but sometimes they have the balance of power in those councils. And then they make for very unstable coalitions because they jump around between the different parties. We've seen the Patriotic Alliance, for example, that has just won that ward in Riverlea. They jumped backwards and forwards between the ANC and the DA in Nelson Mandela Bay, creating complete havoc in trying to govern there. They're going to do very much the same in Johannesburg. I mean, we've just seen that the mayor of Johannesburg, who's an ANC mayor now, just fired the Patriotic Alliance for being corrupt. And so these tiny little one-person parties have disproportionate influence, and very rarely do they stand for anything except the personal interests of their own leaders.
Helen, you're absolutely right. But Gareth, just give me a second, because what Helen is describing is in fact becoming, and I hate to use this phrase, Gareth, but it's becoming the new normal in South Africa. We've seen this process of the land invasions taking place all around the country, and the ANC has been really drip feeding these invasions all over the place. And we've seen these scenarios of land invasions happening out in the Western Cape, for example. We've already had the scenario where the courts have shown that they are disinclined to act decisively against these land invasions. So effectively, this is going to be the pattern going forward. I guess the question that one really needs to ask is what then adopt against this backdrop to prevent a situation where, just simply by a war of attrition, really, suburbs get destroyed and chaos reigns and the ANC triumphs yet again.
Well,
that's absolutely true.
Before you answer that, Helen, I just want to bring Pumi in here because we've been trying to get her back on, and I'm seeing that she's on now. Pums, you were watching these by-elections, and you actually brought up that in some of these wards, much to all of our frustration, there are still people who are voting in enormous numbers. I mean, the margin by which the ANC has won some of them is quite extraordinary, even though the ANC have done so little right and so much wrong over the last while. Do you want to just bring up what you watched yesterday? Because you obviously saw things that we didn't.
Yeah, so I mean, just looking at how some of the key wards, I would say. So the one thing that we saw and that was being reported a lot on is in Soweto and Nandi. In fact, three voting stations had to be moved because the community wouldn't even allow people in there to vote. So they were venting their frustration in one particular way. But the people who did turn, they voted for the ANC. There are a lot of places where, and I'd love to hear the reasoning for this, Helen, is there are a lot of places where the DA wasn't even contesting. There are a lot of places where the DA wasn't contesting. And in places where the DA did contest, even strong DA awards, they saw a decline, and the FF kind of cannibalizing into that margin. And then the EFF, one of the things that I saw and kind of am intrigued by is the EFF's kind of plateauing. So their numbers are not growing tremendously or decreasing. They're just kind of standing stable. But those things for me, again, because this is how democracy works, right? It works with the number of people that show up and who those people vote for. And unfortunately, the ANC still knows how to mobilize within their wards. They still know how to mobilize within their branches and get people in there. But another interesting thing is independence. There's been a lot of independents that have kind of showed up.
I think that's maybe where we were trying to get you on, Pums, but we've spoken a little bit about the independents. Helen, do you want to respond to those questions and those comments from Pumi about, first of all, the ANC, and second of all, why the DA doesn't contest certain places?
Well, we are 1 year away from a general local government election. And at this stage, you don't want to be emptying your election war chest on by-elections where people are just going to be in office for 9 or 10 months. It makes very little sense to do that. You want to obviously defend the wards you've got. You want to identify some strategic wards where you could win. And we had a fantastic win in Walter Sisulu Ward 11 in the Eastern Cape, which we took away from the ANC, which was really fantastic. And we had another very nice win in Machabeng in the Free State. So in the Eastern Cape and the Free State, we won wards, which was fantastic. And we have contested several strategic wards where we thought we were in with a chance. So we certainly didn't only fight to retain wards, we did contest wards where we thought there was a strategic option, but we decided it was not sensible to do blanket coverage 9 or 10 months before the next general election and deplete your electoral coffers when you actually should be building up for the national election. That's the first. Second point is this: you can't ever generalize. You've got to look at things ward by ward. Now, the biggest hit we've had from the Freedom Front Plus is in the Northwest Province. And you will remember that that is the province where the Schweizer Reinecker debacle occurred, where the DA did not stand by its principles and go and get the evidence before they judged people. They went in on basically George Orwell's 4 legs good, 2 legs bad motto and judged that because the woman was white, she must have been in the wrong, and because the complainant was black, she must have been in the right. And they came down heavily on the young white teacher. Turned out to be entirely different. And once voters see you abandon your principles for expedience, they take a long time to regain their trust. And the Northwest Province has been the center of that erosion of trust. We did not expect, for example, not in our wildest dreams did we expect to lose Brits as we did yesterday. Now, we lost the ward in Brits to the ANC, but that's because our own vote was splintered between various different parties. And that's another key lesson. It's not the ANC just winning in its own right. It's the ANC winning because all of these tiny little parties split the opposition vote as much as they do. And that is very worrying because you can say what you like. And you can look at South Africa from any angle that you want. If we are to build a prosperous and peaceful South Africa, where more and more people are living in the middle class, living lives they value, educating their children and getting on with the future, it's got to be at the non-racial center. And it's got to be honest, honorable governments, and that is the space that the DA occupies. Worldwide, that space is taking a battering. I'm hoping, it's my personal view, not my party's view, but with the election of Joe Biden in America, the extremes on both sides will once again go into a bit of a decline, and that the moderate center will reassert itself. I have no doubt that Trump was a reaction to the mad identity politics of the left, and that the mad identity politics of the left fed the fire of Trump, and we had this massive polarization on identity lines. Let's hope that the election of Joe Biden will calm all that down, and that this mad identity politics that is going to tear our own country apart will also subside, so that the rational center can reassert itself.
Okay, let's talk practicalities at this point. And Helen, I don't know if you've been following the extent to which there's progress being made on the court decision that individuals must be allowed to contest the national elections.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, and I assume that there's committee meetings in progress that are talking about how to frame that legislation, because my understanding is that needs to be in place in time for the next elections. And surely that's going to lead to a scenario that's actually going to exacerbate what you've just been describing, this fragmenting of the voting base, so that because of the fact you have currently small parties and then eventually individuals who are contesting as well, and the net effect is to actually chip away at any possible opposition and end up with a scenario where the ANC, simply by its size, ends up taking everything. So isn't it going to get worse?
Well, I think this judgment has put the ANC into the biggest panic of all. Because in places like Pumi was describing in Soweto yesterday, those people are going to be able to put up individual candidates that might not represent any party at all. It might just be a popular local person in a ward. And the ANCs are going to be big, big losers through this. But we're not assuming that South Africa will be a winner. Now, obviously, it depends on the electoral system in which the right for independence to stand becomes embedded. Do we go back to constituencies in South Africa and enable people to vote for a candidate in a particular constituency who need not belong to a party, who can just be an individual from that constituency who stands in his or her own right? That's one option. The other option is to have lists of individuals who are independent, can get elected in various ways, a mixed system like we have in local government. There are lots of discussions about the system, the electoral system in which it should be embedded. Now, we mustn't think that this is great news for democracy, because we have seen in some of our coalitions how devilishly difficult it is to hold something together when a lot of tiny, tiny parties have the balance of power and can decide on their own whim what to do, whether they like something or whether they don't like something. And we've seen in many places, from a small municipality like B2, where, let's say, Peter Lobese stands, he gets some votes in KwaNokotula, and it's just enough to get him in on a remainder, and he holds the balance of power and becomes the mayor, and then can the bigger parties against each other for the best deal he can get out of it. And when there are 5 or 6 or 7 other parties like that that have no discernible political philosophy and no set of policies whatsoever, but just play the system for their own advantage and learn to do that very quickly, having had a tiny voter base that got them elected in the first place, it creates the most untenable instability in government. In Nelson Mandela Bay, we were short of 4 seats, I think, to get an overall majority. If we'd got that, we would have really run a beautiful, stable, proper government in Nelson Mandela Bay. But the fact that all the little tiny parties were in there swapping their allegiances around all the time made good government absolutely impossible. And if you extend what is happening at local government to national government, where you're trying to run a national cabinet with 6 or 7 parties, sounds good, sounds democratic in theory, but believe me, it's going to almost be impossible to manage.
So I just want us to talk about the elephant in the room, because it keeps coming up. And every time that we think in South Africa we're making progress, parties, individuals, Sometimes people who are political actors outside of the actual party structures are trying to foment and create reasons for us to distrust each other across the racial divide. And we've seen, I know you went to Senegal recently, which I think we need to talk about. And I also want to talk a little bit about Brockenfell, because I know Pumi's a mother. She has a child at school. So this is something that brings an emotive weight to this that perhaps wouldn't have been brought if it was just about, some issue that had been made a bigger issue by Julius Malema or whoever else. But because people's children are involved, I think that they're even more touchy about it, and rightly so. So let's talk for a second, and I'll start with you, Pums, because we couldn't get hold of you for the first 5 minutes of the burning platform, which I'm still feeling bad about.
Clear sabotage.
But we need to talk about whether or not there are people who are actively participating in things that are driving us apart, and what they have to gain from that. And what we think we could do about this, because clearly it's not something that's optimal for the country going forward. What do you say to start it, and then I'll go to Helen and Catherine.
Of course, there are people who are fomenting this kind of fragmentation. Of course, the world over, we're seeing it. That's, Helen referred to it. We saw it in America. We see it in Europe. Lots of talk in Europe of seceding in various parts of various countries. All of that is about the polarization of where we are. And, we wish that we could get more stable, more center-based politics. But in South Africa, where we're so touchy and we're so emotional, and there's such a big divide between people who have and people who have not, and that is also characterized by race right now. So it's not like we have lots of people. Most and it's well spread out across all the races. That's part of why it can do that. And everything is emotional for us. Everything is emotional, because everything that affects you directly is an emotional thing. It's about survival for all of us. So you talk about Brockenfell and what happened there, and what happened there, and what people I think have forgotten is that the EFF is, we spoke about it last week, is kind of like this this dog that everybody feels they can sick on people. If you get just enough of the EFF going, they'll be able to show up. So what we don't know is, we don't know how it is that the EFF got the information that they got, and why it is that they were there, right? Somebody from the inside told them that this is a problem. And then to have these incredibly high emotions of parents who feel that their rights are being their rights and their children's rights are being infringed on, with a peaceful protest outside. Everybody in this country has got a right to protest, right? And because tensions are so high, people all arrive with their kind of feeling that the way that they do, they arrive with weapons, and that is a situation that under any and all circumstances will always go bad. And that's what happened there. And we saw parents who probably under any other circumstance would have been rational individuals, but because this was so close to the bone, arrived there already with their tensions high and looking for a fight. So they didn't even see how this thing is playing out before reacting. They arrived looking for a fight, and so started one.
So, Helen, you live in the Western Cape. You obviously know the suburb of Brockenfell well, and I'm sure that you have some insight there that the rest of us don't. But do you want to just comment on that Brockenfell situation, and even throw in a little bit of your experience of Senegal?
Well, Helen Suzman always used to tell us, when in doubt, go back to the principle to analyze every situation. But you also have to start with the facts, and then you look at the facts in relation to the principles. Now, what are the facts? Let's start with those, because that gets the emotion out of the way. The facts are that in all schools, matric balls were cancelled here for obvious reasons. You can't have matric balls with social distancing. So they were cancelled. And instead of having matric balls, small friendship circles, respecting the rules of COVID not to have more than 50 and then later 100 people in the venue, started setting up their own private parties that they organized, that they paid for, and that were entirely private functions. Now, there are 254 matric learners at Brockenfell High School. So 254. Obviously, like all schools, they are mixed race. All of them. I mean, they're mixed racially, put it that way. They're mixed racially. And there was a French circle of 42 people, 42 boys and girls, who got together to have a private party instead of a matric farewell. And somebody claimed that it was racially exclusive. Now, whether or not it was racially exclusive is entirely irrelevant, because people can organize private parties without having the race police measure whether it is demographically representative of South Africa's population. I'm not sure how many parties Julius Malema has organized that were demographically representative of South Africa's population, nor should he have to, because a private thing to do with anybody else, as long as people hold it within the law. And so, to have the EFF decide that they could hold a school responsible for a private function and then arrive to protest the racial composition of a private function was totally out of line. And to say that they were coming there to ensure that they would impose racial representativity on private functions held by pupils at a certain school is totally unconstitutional. Who do they think they are, interfering in people's private lives?
So I don't think that it's fair to say, hold on, Helen, I don't think that it's fair to say that somebody claimed that it was racially exclusive, right? So there are pupils in that school, and to say, I think it's disingenuous to say that there were 42 pupils who organized a private function, which included the school governing body, by the way.
No,
the school governing body was part of it. Hold on. However, the fact that you're saying somebody claimed that it was racially exclusive, and this person is not being named, and this person and how they came to the conclusion that it, and having been the black kid in a predominantly white school, I know how those situations can be. And that's why I'm saying to you that what you see here is you see coming to a head various things that this particular incident then is the inciting incident. But what you're seeing here is you're seeing something that happens all across South Africa, in all of those racially representative schools, as you say, that the power dynamics and the people who believe that they have more of a right than other people, and then assert that right over those people. And what the EFF has become is they have become the party that is willing to take the fight to the people. And what people tend to do is they send the EFF this information because they expect the EFF to stand up for it. And that's what they did here. And then you have the parents who arrive, instead of being calm about it, and arrive in high spirits, looking for a fight. And that's what happened there. There are different ways to resolve these situations, and they could have de-escalated it, and they chose not to.
Humi, the principle here is that people can organize private functions in any way they like.
And people can organize protest. And people can organize protest without being intimidated.
You cannot go and intimidate a school because of a private function held by some pupils at that school.
So they were protesting, and people can organize protest.
Now,
so both people have a right to do what they did.
People have a right to protest, but certainly you've got to be able to protest against something that you have a constitutional right to protest about. Are we going to protest about people's private parties now?
No, I mean,
I'm going to go and protest. I'm going to protest outside the Kuru school where Julius Malema sends his own children every time he holds a private party that is not racially representative.
And you are allowed to do that. You are protected. You are protected in this country. You can do that if you want to do that. And you can organize a group of people to do that.
The primary protection for me, the primary protection is people's freedom to do as they please and not to be interfered on by the government or other people telling them what to do. And the primary freedom
within the constraints of our constitution.
Exactly.
And our constitution, and in schools, Helen.
Constitutions say that private parties have to be racially representative.
I didn't hear that. You broke up. Say that again, please.
I said, I'm not aware.
Constitutions say that people can't have private parties that aren't racially representative.
The Constitution doesn't say people can't have private parties. However, in schools, where there is a particular expectation for all pupils to be treated the same, and then to have a school that apparently, and as what we saw, apparently some people have more rights than others. So yes,
no.
So
they
for
all have a right to organize
is this another is this another form of segregation that we're going to conveniently say is private? At which point does that stop? If we cannot enforce it in our schools.
Can I come in here? Because there's been a case in the United States where there's been a similar argument, although on different facts. So there's a wedding cake shop that didn't want to do a gay wedding cake because they're conservative Christians and they don't believe that that gay marriage is okay. So what happened was that a gay couple went there to try and get their cake made, and the conservative Christians who run that bakery said, no, we don't want to make a cake for you because we don't believe in gay marriage. And then the government got involved. Now, I mean, there are certain things about this case that make me think of that, because the best way for people to protest is to have your own.
There's no analogy whatsoever.
You don't think so?
There's no analogy whatsoever, not at all. I mean, you're running a business and you've got to run it under the Constitution and the law. And the Constitution says that people can love who they like and marry who they like. And when you say, I am not doing that, you are running a business in the public that says, I don't recognize your rights under the Constitution. If you hold a private party, it is an entirely different matter. Anybody can invite whoever they like to their private party. Now, there is plenty to protest about in schools. For example, there are many, many, many schools that are blacks only in South Africa, where the teaching is terrible, where many teachers don't rock up at school, where the only parties that ever happen, and they happen a lot, believe me, and a lot of drinking goes on too, because I've seen it and experienced it myself as MEC of Education, there's no racial representativity there at all. Let's protest around the right things and not get involved in people's private lives. Now, the bottom line is this. No, absolutely, don't get involved in people's private lives. People are allowed to conduct their private lives without the government getting involved and without political parties getting involved. That is what freedom means. Anybody at that school could have held parties. In fact, many parties were held, because 254 matric pupils breaking up into smaller groups can all hold their own parties. But no political party
We seem to have lost. Helen appears to have
party in a different sense.
She's back. Okay, sorry, Helen, we lost you at the point at which you said no political party. If you could just please repeat that bit.
No political party, used in a different sense of the word party, can go and tell private citizens who they may invite to private functions. Once you cross that line, you're in a totalitarian state.
All right, Kanthan, you haven't had a say for a little while. You go ahead, and I know that there are other things that I still want to get to. We're running out of time.
Yes, I think the crucial thing really is we need to recognize that this is going to be the gameplay on the part of the EFF going forward. Yeah. And the fact of the matter is that, by the way, I agree completely with the idea that we should not be even considering for a second that anyone who wants to throw a party where they want to invite people of their choosing needs to consider racial representativity. No, it's rubbish. I invite people to my home or invite people to get together for a braai at the beachfront, and I choose to decide who's going to come along there. And the fact of the matter is, the determining factor is going to be whether they're my friends. It's got nothing to do with their racial makeup. And, the fact that I might happen to have a Black Jewish disabled lesbian there is not because of the fact that she's a Black Jewish disabled lesbian, but because of the fact that she's a friend that I've invited to the party. And the EFF must stuff themselves. But what is going to be happening increasingly is that they are going to be creating these fake, ugly racial incidents. And the question is how one deals decisively with it going forward. And I think the correct answer in terms of how one deals with this type of thing is that the school actually tells people it's a private party, go deal with them. But as soon as you start engaging as a school, it becomes really difficult to find any way to actually defend the scenario, because the questions will keep coming, and they will all be questions that are veiled in terms of innuendo. So they will say, but, aren't you in fact subtly encouraging racism? And what is the correct answer? This is along the same lines as, Mr. Pillay, do you still beat your wife? So it's not going to end up working.
They were having matric exams and other exams, and to have the roads to the school blocked and to have loud protests outside the school makes it incumbent on the school to say, we had nothing to do with this party. It was a private party. And could you kindly stop protesting outside our schools during exams? And parents got mighty fed up with that and came along. Now, that does not for a moment justify, not for a moment does it justify violence in retaliation. And I would never justify that.
Well, actually, as a parent, Helen, I must say that, if you are trying to prevent my kid from getting to her exams, I will get violent. Well, I will get violent because what you are doing is you are obstructing my child's future. And that's ultimately what we need to be doing as parents, as individuals. We need to take responsibility for the future of our children.
But the point I'm making, Kanthan, is that the school has no option but to get involved if the EFF pitches up at the school to protest. What does the school do? It said this had nothing to do with us. And one of the teachers was invited to the party, and another teacher was invited. They came very briefly, but they're also private individuals who are allowed to go to a party. I mean, this is so absurd. But
so there are many ways within which to deal with this situation. What is wrong is the way in which this situation was dealt with. And there's no way that we're going to justify
the EFF.
Okay,
so the parents were wrong. The parents
what was the correct way then, Pumi? Pumi, what's the correct way? Tell us.
Law enforcement. Nobody in this country has a right to enforce the law by themselves.
Yes, but law enforcement is captured, and particularly law enforcement in the Western Cape. Western Cape has lower numbers of police per capita than the rest of the country.
Yeah, and that's probably on purpose. Nod and
absolutely right. But again, it brings me back to my question: how do we frame a way forward? Because this is going to be normality for us in this country, and surely we need to be crafting out solutions.
Well, that's why I draw parallels with the Weimar Republic. It's a bit of history that I happen to know very, very well. And it's exactly the same kind of thing. And Pumi's laughing. You can laugh as much as you like, but believe me, this is not going to end well. It's not going to end well at all. Because what happens is that a majority government that is corrupt, that totally destroys an economy, that destroys the future of all its children, and that makes it impossible to progress and puts nearly 40% of people in the unemployment queue, which could go up to 50%, they start looking for scapegoats, and they see a relatively high-performing and far less poor minority. And then it's very, very easy to say, we are poor because you aren't poor. We've got bad education because you haven't got bad education. You are to blame. And that is a very nice way of taking the blame away from where it should be, in the hands of a corrupt, incompetent, criminal government, and start blaming a small minority. And that's how scapegoating starts. And it starts through all these tiny little incidents of turning private parties into a lightning conductor for the massive failure of the national government to improve the vast majority of schools where most children are doomed to go. And so that is how we get a complete diversion and goal displacement from where the argument should be to people, intelligent people, picking over whether invitations to a private party were the real cause of some race incident in South Africa. These are all pathetic diversions, and they are leading to the scapegoating of minorities with a captured state, and they are going to lead South Africa in a way that will only end in deep tears, including for Pumi and her children.
The good news is that we live in a democracy where other parties can contest the election, and if they didn't eat themselves from the inside, they would actually have an opportunity to put their policies in place and become the alternative for people. Where there are no alternatives as we currently have, we have many parties in this country that are self-immolating, burning themselves up because of internal strife, because they would rather polarize the country. And that is where we are. We have a democracy, and we have many individuals who are in positions of power in those alternative parties who choose to rather stand on the sidelines and say, this government is corrupt, instead of saying, if I were government, this is what I would do differently.
Pumi, I'm going to disagree at this point. We have not had a democracy since the state of disaster was declared.
Exactly. That's
so
number
8
one.
months. 8 months is why all the alternative parties have failed to put policies and have failed to seduce the voting majority to their side of the line because of 8 months. Is that what you're saying, Catherine?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. When you haven't had the ability to organize, when you haven't had the ability to actually get people out to public places and actually plot strategy around by-elections, as an example. You know, under normal circumstances, one would have been able to canvass in these wards. And Helen, I'm not giving you a free pass here. I'm just pointing out that there were very real obstacles. So because of the fact that the ANC does effectively control the law enforcement in this country, they're still able to do things like go out to those wards and canvass and do all of that stuff. And the DA's attempts to do the same thing in those places would have been shot down as being contrary to the state of disaster declarations. So I think that there were very real practical things, Pumi, that happened over the past 8 months. But I think that your point in terms of right now, there isn't, but Gareth, we've spoken about this on the show as well, that until such time as we actually put forward a vision that everyone in this country can buy into, we're not going to have anyone actually wanting to get out of bed in the morning and go to the polls.
Well, I want to give Helen the last word. She is our guest this morning. So Helen, do you want to respond to Kanthan and Pumi's points here?
I actually do. 25 years ago, the DA, in its then incarnation, was a 1.7% party. In 2016, we went up to 26%. That was more than 1 out of every 4 votes. We all know what happened then. Through weak leadership and poor direction and lack of vision and deviating from our core political philosophy, we started to crumble. But nevertheless, to say that we have not had an alternative vision and an alternative set of policies, you can only be living under a rock to say that. There is no party with as comprehensive a set of principles and policies as the Democratic Alliance. None. And from a tiny, irrelevant opposition party to become a party of government in 30 local authorities and in a province. And we governed really well in comparison, and we did not steal money, and we won international awards, and Cape Town was for about 5 or 6 years running voted the best city in the world. You don't do that because you're not offering an alternative and that you don't have policies to put to people. And when people continue to vote for a criminal syndicate posing as a government, then it's time to ask a few questions about the electorate and look at the alternatives that some opposition parties are putting very clearly, very forcefully, and very honestly to the voters.
All right, guys, I'm afraid that's all we got time for. Helen, it's always good to have you on, and thank you for stirring up the required amount of controversy for the morning.
I just want to ask a final question, please, Gareth. Helen, are you still going to be active on Twitter?
Well, I'm sort of, I've taken to Facebook. Well, then I can explain what I'm saying more. Twitter, you've got to keep it to 240 characters and no one gets it. And then the whole EFF botnet army, the only thing they've really got is a botnet, will get out there and carry on. And then idiots in the mainstream media will take it seriously. And then we all know the story from there. So that's it.
So it sounds like
on Facebook
yes and a no.
Whatever.
So you're on Facebook.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Helen's not going to. She's not going to shut up, and that's one of the things that I'm kind of encouraged by. I don't want people to shut up.
And I'm very encouraged by that as well. Please keep tweeting.
Well, the bottom line is we have to get South Africa to work.
Yeah.
I've got grandchildren here. I want them to flourish and live a life where everyone can be successful in South Africa. But we've got to be honest. We've got to have principles, and we mustn't hide behind emotion and race identity. And then we can make progress.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Pumi. Thank you, Canton. And we will see everybody again next Thursday for the Burning Platform. It's been brought to you by Nando's this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Helen. Cheers. Cheers, Pums. Cheers, Canton. Thanks, guys.